So my talk is called Truly an Age of Empires, Coded Colonialism and Subaltern Histories in Video Games. I'm extremely grateful to all of you for listening and also to my co-presenters and to the discussants uh, and all those who have engaged with this with the initial conception of this talk. So I have put here a screenshot from Age of Empires, which is a game that I grew up with. The first video game, one of the first video games besides Road Rash and Need for Speed, that I played as shareware on a chip magazine CD, and we never had the whole game. But the concept of a game which kind of told or retold history intrigued me. So that's Age of Empires for you. Of course, I mean, as you know, Age of Empires is in the line of this series of games which have an an intrinsic kind of engagement with imperialism, colonialism, way back from the 1970s, really, with Hammurabi, and in the 80s with this educational game called Oregon Trail. You have kind of a screenshot from Oregon Trail here, or Trail here, and then Age of Empires in 1997. Clones like not clones, but kind of similar spin-offs like Empire Earth, which was actually developed by somebody who was in the Age of Empires team. And then later on, well, even more blatantly named Empire Total War. So a title like Empire and Total War connected together. A recent game, much more recent in the late 2000, sorry, in the first decade of this well 2000. So um, now my question is why do we have these uh, games which are themed on imperialism, colonialism, and people seem to be extremely okay with it, and I'm kind of trying to argue that there is an intrinsic kind of colonial notion that is there within the way these game algorithms are conceptualized. So my first inquiry will be what actually has been asked regarding this in game studies. What questions have been raised already in video games research? And speaking of colonization, we have Marco Eskelinen way back in 2000, in the very outset of game studies, the discipline, asking or stating that games are being colonized by other disciplines such as literature, theater, drama, and film studies. So the word colonization, the concept of colonization is there, is out, but it's never kind of applied to colonialism, to empire, but it's applied in a very different sense of game studies itself being colonized. And then we have a book expressly named Games of Empire by Nick Dyer Withford and Greg DePoiter, and there the authors say that empire is a term with a long and bloody genealogy. Games themselves nominate empire as the theme of a strategy genre, etc. And they say that an entire study about empire, an entire study of games about empire could be written. This, however, is not our purpose. So they work on empire as in empire, the concept used by Hart and Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, and they talk about biopolitics, biopower. They talk about the entire culture of gaming, game development, but they do not actually focus on games about empire. Of course, in 2010, uh, kind of like a decade after kind of game studies is kind of formally established, We have Sybil Lams talking about games that are actually related to the post-colonial culture that we live in. So the word post-colonial comes in here, and she is directly kind of addressing games that have partly been shaped partly by our colonial histories, cultural notions related to the colonial past. And she's of course looking at cartographic places, spaces. And then much later, of course, again in 2017, in my own work, I address the post-colonial directly, and I still see that it has remained on the margins of game studies, which now incorporates at length contemporary debates of race, gender, and other areas that challenge the canon. Somehow, colonialism and imperialism still remains not in the central focus of game studies, although race, gender, and other areas of equality, inclusiveness, diversity kind of. So that's what that's kind of gives you a general kind of like picture of how things have developed. And of course, now there is an increasing body of work on games and post-colonialism that is engaging games and post-colonialism. But then again, let's look at some of the games that some of the AAA games, some of the major games that are played, uh, and I'll just take three examples, three very different examples. Lara Croft, Tomb Raider. Looking at the name Tomb Raider again, kind of the whole idea of raiding, going to tombs, or raiding, or then going basically that kind of notion in the title itself. But then Lara Croft is somebody who is not again like an Indiana Jones type archaeologist who goes to different cultures and then takes away the artifacts. So similarly, another similar game, Uncharted. Uncharted, again, a game about kind of exploring or retrieving treasure. And Uncharted 4, Thief's End, for example, the storyline is about kind of a, a looting of a Mughal ship by a pirate captain and his treasure. So again, there is a colonial story there, the East India Company, the Mughal Emperor, all of these. But then it's kind of covered. It's kind of like becomes a side story basically. And look at the name of the game, Uncharted. Again, the whole idea of charting, mapping, and kind of naming cartographically, kind of bringing under control. Uh, kind of that comes in here. Uh, and the last game on the slide is Assassin's Creed. Uh, if you're looking anti-clockwise, that is Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry. This is a game where a former slave, Adewale, is kind of is freeing the slave settlement of Saint Domingue, and you see him at a slave market, and he's freeing the slaves. Now, this is all kind of really encouraging because it's showing the game developers kind of engaging with a problem like slavery, like colonialism, empire. Uh, but then somebody, one of a game researcher colleague once pointed out to me that the slaves that are freed become currency in the game because they help upgrades Adewale's weapons, and so it's kind of there's a problem there as well. And then it's again, as Adrian Shaw has earlier commented on Assassin's Creed 3, that the point of view somehow becomes a very white male gaze, really. I mean, the player, the implied player, if I'm to kind of well use Wolfgang Iser's or modify Wolfgang Iser's term, implied reader, the implied player is not kind of somebody who is from a global south colonial context. So my problems that I want to raise here, problems and again kind of issues that kind of respond to these problems, is that there is a colonialist logic that is hard coded into game algorithms and in the ways that these video games are presenting history. And then, of course, let's take an example. Um, this game based on World War II, Battlefield 1. Now, Battlefield 1, the entire game does not contain a single reference to an Indian soldier except just one kind of Indian soldier, Indian doctor, a medical doctor who features in the trailer of the game. So when about 1 million Indian soldiers fought in the First World War, not one Indian soldier features in the game. This is also extremely kind of, again, these are also critiques that have been raised in the case of films, for example, films like Dunkirk, etc. But this is kind of this logic that is hard coded, that that certain kind of groups are almost written out of this history that is presented. And then, of course, it is, the whole idea of kind of empire, of kind of conquering space, of moving into land and occupying it, of of maintaining oversight, then kind of mapping, and through maps controlling the space. This is all kind of part of the colonialist logic. It's hard coded into the algorithms. Likewise, I said about Adewale kind of freeing slaves, and then the slaves then becoming currency. Of course, one might argue that games are a multiple medium, and they allow counterfactuality. And this counterfactuality actually allows you to play against empire, play against the narratives of empire. So maybe a colonized country in a game can fight back and then colonize another country. But that is problematic for me because that also kind of involves the same uh, kind of colonialist logic. It's it's not one country but the other that is doing this. And then, of course, there's the other notion of counterplay, as in you can play in a different way. You can play the game in a different way. You can game the game. You can game the system, and you can do other things the game is not really pushing you to do. But even so, the notion of counterplay for me also assumes the notion of an agency. Now, if we are to look at um, works of subaltern historians, historians who talk about the subaltern. The subaltern is a concept that comes from Antonio Gramsci's prison notebooks. In this context, it is used in the case of understanding minority histories, be they of ethnic groups, gay rights activists, or subaltern social classes. And this is about groups which do not have any archival history or any written or any direct dominant kind of discourse of history. Counterplay is for people who have agency. What about those who do not have agency? What about the subaltern? As Gayatri Spivak phrases this in a famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? And the answer is, well, the question is rhetorical, really. In which case, perhaps I would see the need to incorporate the representations of the subaltern, or the or providing a means of subaltern pasts to be to emerge in the multiplicity of the video game. And together with the notion of the subaltern, of course, comes the notion of colonial difference. That is a concept by Walter Mignolo, where Mignolo says that the degree of difference created by the 16th century missionary or the 19th century European intellectual that was based on who possessed the alphabet and which people have a history. Now, Mignolo argues that the process of colonial translation has effaced the colonial difference. Within a framework of globalization, the difference is rendered less obvious, but it is there. This is the difference. And he says that, look, again, I mean, the history is written in Russian, sorry, the history is written in English, German, and French are are kind of very obvious and clear to us, but those in Arabian, Russian, or some other language are not. So again, there is this, and this is what Mignolo calls border thinking, thinking into and across borders. And this border thinking recovers this notion of difference. So I would say that in these games, then it is necessary for the thinking through in subaltern, in the ways of subaltern history, in the methodologies of subaltern history, and through border thinking to actually kind of unpack the colonialist logic that is hard coded in these schemes, and to critique this logic, and to create, if we are creating kind of opportunities of counterplay, then let it be through kind of actually by kind of unpacking and kind of by letting letting kind of the problems emerge by engaging in border thinking. So I'll give you one example. See, video games. Recently, in a talk, Ida Christina Jorgensen in the History of Games conference, she linked Robert Louis Stevenson's adventure games, Robert Louis Stevenson's novels to adventure games. And I was kind of I found it quite compelling. And I myself kind of agree with that kind of an analysis. And it is intriguing that the maps in adventure stories for boys like those of Treasure Island or King Solomon's Mines by Ryder Haggard, they have maps. And these maps are often anthropomorphic. For example, King Solomon's Mines is Sheba's breasts, then kind of it's like a human figure which is to be kind of taken over, colonized. And with Treasure Island again, there are these dark spaces that need to be explored and then kind of commanded, controlled. Just like we have spaces in Age of Empires, the fog of war, the dark space that needs to be removed, and then you place watchtowers, forts, and what have you, and buildings, and you kind of control the territory by sight, just like the great trigonometric survey that was conducted in India, and also similar surveys in Africa. So, I mean, again, kind of look at I've put in the map of the Oregon Trail game right in the middle, and the Oregon Trail, the story by Francis Parkman, the not the story but the account of Francis Parkman. The whole idea is about kind of manifest destiny, is about kind of exploring, about pushing through, moving down this kind of pathway to possess, to take over, and to displace the indigenous tribes that are there, really. So the idea of the map is to facilitate, the map exists to facilitate movement for the colonial forces. In fact, even how the map is seen, the world is seen, is basically is quite strange, because it follows the marketer's kind of projection, which where we see Africa as being much smaller than it really is, because of the necessity to kind of project and show the importance of Europe. Maybe. So with video games again, we have the maps also kind of engaging in a similar kind of colonialist logic, and that I agree, that I argue is hard coded into the playing of the game. But then, of course, as I've said about border thinking and subalternity, that games also, in the multiplicity that researchers on counterfactuality and counterplay have already pointed at, that games allow uh, the messages from the fishers, from the not so obvious kind of colonial logic that Mignolo says that border thinking needs to kind of unpick and kind of point out to the world. Games also do this, and especially, for example, let us look at a response to the Oregon Trail game by Elizabeth Laponzi, uh, who uh, makes this game called Where Rivers Were Trails. And Where Rivers Were Trails, the Oregon Trail narrative is now told from the indigenous kind of Native American kind of people's stories. And you see that I just read this quote out to you and it'll be obvious. So, When Rivers Were Trails aims at conveying the experiences of many indigenous people and how land allotment, a process of privatizing and reallocating indigenous lands, impacted them. Allotment proponents supported the policy for different reasons, including viewing the indigenous lifeways and collective land use as uncivilized, seeing individual private property as an essential trait of civilization that would aid in assimilating indigenous people, and wanting indigenous lands opened up for settlement, railroads, mining, forestry, and other industries. So then there's this dominant narrative that takes over, but then this is what Where Rivers Were Trails is challenging, because it is getting the player to engage as indigenous people of the United States, and then kind of explore their plight, or kind of look at the scenario from their point of view. Or let's look at Somewhere, which is a project by Studio Oleomingus. You see all these many eyes in the wall, very surrealist kind of picture. And this is about a place called Kayamgad. Uh, Now, the story of Kayamgad is being discovered by a colonial officer of the British Raj, and what the developers describe it as is that people of Kayamgad do not speak. They are afraid that their words might penetrate the layers under which their bodies are hidden. Afraid that some phrase or name might, through wool caps or cotton plugs or bald bits of torn rags, enter their buried ears and insert itself in their thoughts, prompting them to think of Kayamgad not as they see it, but as it is being described to them by the person speaking these words. Now, think of it this way: the people of Kayamgad do not speak. The subaltern can the subaltern speak? And they do not speak because they're afraid that their very speech might kind of change what they are. Their very speech might kind of change what they are, or what Kayamgad is for them, to what it is for somebody else. And that is a fear of the colonized. That is a fear of an epistemic violence, if I might say so, a knowledge system that is taking over and changing your knowledge system forever. Now, so my aim here was just to kind of point out how video games have this tendency to kind of privilege a colonialist logic at times. But then, of course, how there are methodologies that are being explored today by game researchers and game developers, and sometimes a combination of the two, to kind of explore the fissures of the messages that are there, to explore the marginal voices that do not get heard, like the non-player characters in Age of Empires who are controlled by the player, or the nations that are not playable, for example, in Empire Total War, like the Barbary pirates. But then this is what, and then the logic of well, occupying territory by kind of occupying space in maps, increasing your line of sight. All of these can be challenged, are being challenged by thinking through uh, the position, a position which is different from the dominant position, a position from the fissures, the position from the margins, the position from the cracks, the dominant discourse. So that is pretty much it from me. Thank you very much. It was a short kind of bibliography, uh, which you might look at if you're interested. And please do send me messages on Twitter or email if you have any questions and comments. Thank you very much.